Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, The Green Rush to Renewable Energy, the Perfect Climate for Corruption. We're looking forward to an exciting discussion with each and every one of you, and more specifically with our panel of experts within the industry. Before I introduce the speakers and we get started, please note that we will be answering questions at the end of the presentation today. Please feel free during the presentations to submit a question at any time by typing your question within the question tab on the control panel located on the right-hand side of each of your screens. We will get to as many questions as possible, and any questions that we are not able to address on the webinar today, we will provide a written response back to you from the team that is presenting today. A replay of today's presentation along with our PowerPoint slides will also be made available for each and every one of you early part of next week. Next slide, please. My name is John Arvanitis, and it's a pleasure to be here with each and every one of you today around the globe. I've been with Kroll for approximately 7 years, working in the compliance risk and diligence business line, working with clients in developing and assessing their AML, FCPA, bribery and corruption related matters, and providing due diligence, training, and other compliance related functions as needed. Prior to joining the firm, I spent 27 years in federal law enforcement, criminal investigator by trade, having overseen as a senior executive my former agency's global money laundering and terrorist finance programs. I'm going to now move to introduce our other panelists. Before I do that, unfortunately, due to personal circumstances, Tariq Khalif is unable to join us today from Mass Energy. Should anyone have any questions specifically that you are hoping to present to Tariq, please don't hesitate to send those in to us so that we can get them addressed as well. Our first panelist is Amro Ahmed. Amro is the head of risk and oversees Yellow Door Energy's risk assessment processes across all markets, which includes designing and managing investments, liquidity, and counterparty risk analysis, the assessing of risk of potential solar and energy efficiency investments, and the monitoring of risks as operational assets. Amro, thank you for taking the time to participate with us today, and we look forward to your insights and your commentary. Our next panelist is my colleague, Tom Hollowbone. Tom is a managing director also within the compliance risk and diligence practice based in our London office. In his capacity, he advises clients and oversees EMEA research and operations teams as it relates to compliance functions. Tom also works closely with multiple Kroll components to include investigations, transaction advisory, and our cybersecurity teams. Tom leverages over 16 years of experience in due diligence, corporate transaction due diligence, third-party and vendor screening, business intelligence, and C-suite pre-employment screening. Tom's expertise revolves around anti-bribery and corruption, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and of course the UK Bribery Act. So for today's agenda, subsequent to the introductions, we'd like to provide each and every one of you with an overview and specific commentary relating to industry analysis within the renewable industry, best practices as it relates to risk, third party, and due diligence, and then close with a question and answer session relative to any questions that have been submitted. The purpose of this webinar series is to discuss a variety of scenarios and share experiences on key considerations when entering the renewables market, whether via direct investment or by working with previously unknown operators or partners around the globe. The contributors today, as I said, will provide an overview of the risk life cycle of renewable projects and answer questions to help you prepare for and manage bribery and corruption risks presented by third parties and other components within your supply chain. So let's get started. But prior to getting started, to the audience, we've just prepared an audience poll question. Please take a moment and answer the question. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Hollabone, who's going to provide an industry overview.
Great, thank you very much, John. Great, so as you can see on the screen, quick poll for everyone. The question is, what is the expected share of renewable energy sources in the total global electricity generation by 2040? So if you can submit your answers, click on the screen, that will come through to us. And we'll give everyone a couple of seconds to answer, and then we can go through and look at the correct answer. Great, thank you very much. So we can see the majority of people here went for 45%, which is exactly the correct answer. So obviously lots of well-informed people on the call today. But what we want to do today, as well as we've got a good understanding of where everyone's kind of knowledge is, we want to take you through a quick overview, quick introduction to the industry and what we're seeing at the moment. And then we can move further through, talk to Ambro, and we can close with some comments from me. So yeah, as many of you will know, the renewables industry has very much moved to the forefront of energy production. And with the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement and with COP26 taking place in the UK in November, there's a huge focus on renewable energy at the moment and how it can help countries to meet their goals to reduce carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. And as we can see here, renewable energy capacity has been increasing steadily over the last 5 years. And in the last year, we can see that wind and solar has been the significant contributors for 2020. And more interestingly, we can also see here the split in the share of new electricity generating capacity. We can see the increase in renewable sources in blue is vastly outweighing the increases in non-renewable sources in grey as we move further up to 2020. So moving on, what we can see though is that that's resulted here in a rush to renewables, and not just from companies purely focused on this industry as it is. We're also seeing some of the oil and gas majors pivoting and focusing their attention, and more importantly, their vast resources on building or acquiring renewable energy sources. But we're also seeing major corporations looking to use renewable energy directly by developing their own off-grid setups on their land or buildings to try and help reduce the cost and to do their bits as part of their corporate social responsibility goals. And in the last few years, I think we've really seen that there has been a huge corporate commitment to achieving net zero emissions, and this really is one of the ways that a lot of companies are looking to do that. But with this growth and this focus comes risk. And as we've seen, more and more companies are jumping into this growth industry, looking for opportunities to benefit. And there is no more of a perfect storm for corruption and opportunity for corruption to surface than what we're seeing here at the moment. And you can see a couple of examples of what has happened on screen now. So as an operator in the renewable sector, Amro has some great experiences here that he would like to share with us also. Amro, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to take you through the industry analysis, and I will share with you a case study today. for something that a case that actually happened for my company at the moment. So just to very quickly introduce my company, founded in 2015. Now we have 120 plus megawatts. We have presence in 5 countries: UAE, Jordan, Pakistan, Saudi, Bahrain, and we expand into other markets as well, other countries this year. Next slide, please. We have institutional shareholders, and I'm going to comment on that on the next few slides, and the importance of having institutional shareholders when it comes to compliance and policies and regulations. Next slide, please. So first of all, I'm going to take you through the evolution of the renewable industry. So globally, global installed renewable capacity is forecasted to grow from 22.5% in 2021 to 32% by 2030. This is further expected to rise to 45%, which was the majority answer for the poll question today, which is absolutely spot on. Obviously, with all this transition, that means that a lot of new players would come to the market, both customers, vendors, suppliers, etc., which obviously means that we need to be more vigilant and we need to pay more attention. I'm going to go specifically into pick the UAE, where we headquartered. The UAE's non-hydro renewable sector will continue to register robust growth over the coming decade. The capacity growing at an annual average of 16.7%. That's of course a very, very big percentage, and it means a lot. It means that the industry will continue to evaluate and change. The ongoing transition has resulted in the energy company landscape seeing a mix of new customers, mix of new suppliers. I remember a few years back, it was only 3-4 businesses dominating the market. Now there's more than 13 different companies that provide similar services, obviously in line with these figures. It's very important when assessing infrastructure initiatives that the most common challenges of those include the counterparty and the customers and KYC and compliance. It's very important that we pay attention to all of these. Next slide, please. I'm going to be explaining here, covering 2 very important and critical concepts in good risk management. Those are called 3 lines of defense and proactive risk management culture versus reactive. So I'll start with the 3 lines of defense. At YGE, Renewable Energy, the company I work for at the moment, we pride ourselves in a robust risk management practices. We do use this defense, the 3 lines of defense framework, which I took off from my banking experience. The first line is the frontline colleagues, our commercial guys who go out there to meet the customers and vet the businesses that we forecast to the prospect. It's very important that those colleagues have received sufficient coaching and well aware of what is it to look for when it comes to prospecting customers. Second line of defense is the risk management. So the risk management needs to be responsible for establishing policies, procedures, continuously coaching the first line of defense, which are the commercial colleagues or the vendors, the procurement, etc., to pick up all and understand and read between the lines to pick up all the red signs. And then finally, the third line is the compliance and audit, quality assurance. The important of those, usually they should have independent reporting, and they oversight both the first line and the second line. I'm going to bring this to life in the next slide when I talk about my case study. After that, what we've got here, the second concept is the proactive risk management culture. So in risk, the best risk practices is that you do not wait until an event happens and then you react. You should have everything in place to be able to spot that risk and identify that risk and mitigate it before it actually happens. You should be able to forecast, you should be able to predict it. Proactive risk management aims to reduce the future risk by identifying red flags early on in the stage, versus the reactive risk management, which is a response-based approach to risk. Again, I'm going to use the combination of these two frameworks in my next slide when I talk about the case study. Next slide, please. So this is an actual case study, which of course we removed all the names and the country and all the dates, etc., for the purpose of this exercise. So from left to right, analysis. So our commercial team, as they do, they were out there prospecting, and they found a very interesting customer that was interested in a solar opportunity. During our discussion, typical discussion we had, and once an opportunity has materialized enough, we started to do our usual KYC and compliance, and requested the typical structure chart, KYC documents, CBO. The structure chart we received was quite vague and complex, very complex in fact, for a business of that nature. So we asked the customer more questions because we couldn't identify clearly what the UBO was. The customer did not particularly like that we were asking so many questions, and they asked, why are you asking these questions? We're going to just sign a contract and you're going to provide us with energy, clean energy, for our corporate social responsibility side of things. So we insisted on obtaining all the documents and all the KYC documents and a clear structure chart so we can identify and understand exactly what the business do. In fact, we've done an extensive due diligence. Eventually, we found out that the UBO, and that's the UBO stands for Ultimate Beneficiary Owner, was engaged in armed dealing. Of course, straight away, we walked away, and we've done what we should have done. We've used some lesson learned. So the lesson learned that we had from this case study was that we need to provide more regular coaching to our colleagues in the first line of defense. Second point is that actually the 3-line of defense framework is in fact effective. It did work because in this case, risk management managed to detect and to lead this conversation with the customer and potentially exit this relationship. Obviously, with no relationship, but exit the potential relationship. Third one, if the customer is withholding information, actually they're probably hiding something. Why do you don't want to be transparent and share all the information you want to share with us? Proactive risk management concept would have saved us 6 months of negotiation, because we've only came to this conclusion after 6 months of talking to this customer and obviously going through all the development process, the drawing and getting ready for the project and everything, to find out that we can't do this deal because of obviously compliance issues. Direct debit and vetting should not just include customers, it should include every single business in the supply chain, whether a supplier, a vendor, and a customer, all should go through a comprehensive direct due diligence and vetting. Conclusion and going forward, we agreed that forward-thinking initiative and proactive culture and proactive risk management versus the reactive is absolutely the sustainable way and the way to be leading the market and leading business, a sustainable growth for where we are. Next slide, please. Finally, we don't just have to worry about the credit risk side of things and the compliance risk. There's also reputation risk. Reputation risk is associated with the environmental and social risk. When we do a project, we don't just go and find a piece of land and develop a project. We have to do studies on the community, environment. We have to agree on a proposed mitigation measures to minimize any negative environment and social impact in the back of the project. we must design and specify an environmental and social management system, including local community communication portal. So if the local community have any issues, they have a directed channel to talk to us. This is all reputation risk and very important to bear in mind when developing projects. Finally, we, as a company, and going back to the institutional shareholders, we had to comply with a lot of certification and a lot of regulations to be able to agree and to establish a very strong and robust institution investors, such as the ones we have. So an example of that, so we have a very robust QHSSE, that stands for Quality, Health, Safety, Social, Environmental Management System. It is compliant at the moment. We're compliant with ISO 9001, ISO 14001, ISO 45001, and as well as IFC 8 performance standards, which is very complex and one of the best for what we do. Thank you so much, and I pass it back to you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Amro. I think, speak for everyone to say it was great to see the compliance processes working well to protect the business, and that's the most important part. But that's a theme that I want to certainly kind of elaborate on further, and want to take a couple of points that Amro discussed and expand on them in terms of what can be done to address those risks. For those of you on the call, and we've got a wide range of people on the call, from investors, from operators in the space, but also from manufacturers of equipment that is in this sector. So we're going to talk broadly about that. Hopefully this is something that will apply to everyone. But obviously, if there are any questions, please continue to put those through to us using the questions tab. So possibly the easiest way to get through all this and start is to start at the beginning of a project. So a lot of companies find themselves moving into countries they're not familiar with, or even this might be their first kind of foray into the renewables market. And understanding the risks that are going to be present going forward is essential. And from a market entry risk perspective, this insight might come in the form of how certain processes work, or what others in similar situations have struggled with in the past. And I wanted to quickly mention an interesting study that was undertaken by U4 and Transparency International, which covered some anti-corruption risk and other risks in the renewable energy sector. And they highlighted how these risks can manifest themselves in different countries and have different impacts. So for example, in Ethiopia, the risks present primarily occur at the political and regulatory stage. And with hidden barriers to market entry, they found that investors were likely to be more reliant on government support to implement a project, meaning that larger scale kind of on-grid projects are more common and certainly more successful. But they looked at some other countries, and the other country that came up, for example, was Kenya, where the challenges are very different. Land access and a higher risk of protests are really kind of key areas of concern. And therefore, projects with sizable kind of physical presence can sometimes flounder because of this, but off-grid options may not encounter as much opposition in the Kenyan context. And this is a really good example about those challenges that are present will really differ depending on the market that you're operating in, and even the regions within those countries that you're looking to place those assets. But what about once those projects are off the ground? What about the ongoing geopolitical risks? And as you can see here, there are a number of geopolitical events that can manifest themselves, and the risks and consequences that are carried with that. So looking through the list just very briefly, expropriation is certainly a concern. Governments can confiscate assets, they can nationalize property, they can decide to breach contracts, and litigation to change that is obviously going to be very expensive and drawn out. But they can also impose embargoes or prohibit trade with specific countries. And changes in the government or changes to those situations can potentially pose quite the risk to your operations, to your investment. And understanding that is really key. With regulatory burdens, governments can discriminate against foreign firms by imposing stringent regulatory requirements or more stringent regulatory requirements on them. They can limit foreign direct investment. And they can also allow monopolies from the domestic industries to form. And one element that we've seen in places with high levels of corruption among lawmakers is making, securing the necessary licenses and permits and registrations a very difficult and arduous process, especially for those of us who have to stay in compliance with the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act and the UK Bribery Act, for example, like John mentioned earlier. When facilitation payments are being asked for in those situations, it makes it very, very difficult to understand how to navigate that. Violence and civil unrest, I'm sure you all know, is a key kind of concern. Organized crime syndicates, terrorist organizations, rebel groups can threaten supply chains, can threaten assets, and can threaten personnel of foreign firms. And this very much is something that you should understand before you move into sectors that are not known to you. There's cultural missteps as well, careless efforts to understand social and cultural dynamics of kind of communities that foreign firms are looking to operate in, superficial attempts to engage stakeholders. It can quickly upset the kind of the local standing and turn biases into something more serious that can lead to potentially negative media attention, can lead to protests, and again, efforts have to be made to fully understand that. And last and certainly not least, human rights violations. Operations in countries with poor human rights records can really have detrimental effect to supply chains, to reputational damage, and potentially you could be looking at issues such as public boycotts or stockholder divestment campaigns, which is something that we very much have seen in the past. So how to mitigate this? It really is a case of understanding where you're going to and what's going on in the situation at that moment in time. Identifying those risks, and this is really a theme that you'll hear me talking about all the way through, is identifying those risks and understanding them and looking and identifying ways to mitigate them is really the only way to do this in a manner that's going to be sustainable going forwards. So moving on, having talked about country risk assessment, this can really form the backbone of a physical risk assessment and crisis management planning process. So as part of this, companies should really look to identify and document these risks, map out the potential situations and outcomes that may have come from that initial assessment, and set plans in place and ensure that they're also clearly communicated to all of those people that could be directly or indirectly affected. Everyone needs to know what their process and their plan is, their responsibilities are, if something was to happen. So one thing that we've helped to do, help clients to do when conducting some of these assessments is to go in and understand how to protect their assets and their staff from whatever those risks are that are present in the environment that they're operating. But we've also been brought in to test existing systems to find those gaps. Sometimes, with the knowledge of all those people involved, but otherwise, sometimes without the knowledge of maybe the people on the ground. And we can test how they respond in certain situations, what they do when they're challenged, what they do when certain situations and systems are breached, and then that can provide key insight into refining some of those plans. But it's good to remember that the risk assessment is only a snapshot of that moment in time. And it's important to monitor those risks and keep up to date with events as they develop. And lastly, I wanted to mention the unknown unknown. Maybe not necessarily the most useful thing on its own, but we advise a lot of clients to plan for what they haven't planned for, to have a process in place when something doesn't meet their set criteria that they already have mapped out. So it's no good having a plan for X number of eventualities if something comes up that doesn't fit that plan and no one knows what to do. So ensure there's a plan in place, ensure that decision makers are notified and there's a chain of command that's been established and everyone knows who to look to for further information. So we wanted to move on and talk about identifying specifically reputational issues and bad actors. And Amro has kind of touched on this already, but there are plenty of bad actors out there in the marketplace that are looking to benefit from organizations who don't look into their backgrounds, or if they realize too late who they're dealing with. And one example that really springs to mind that I wanted to talk about was for a client who was looking to create a joint venture to continue to develop a wind power project in Romania. And we talked a lot about solar, and I think this is a really good one from the wind perspective. Now, some of the turbines had already been installed, but they needed further investment to continue and install the rest of those turbines in the country. And they were partnering with an existing renewable energy company that had a track record, and they wanted us to look into this entity and its management. But they also wanted us to look into their local Romanian partners and associated individuals kind of with that. So on conducting the due diligence, we identified an individual that was part of their project list of personnel who had very, very interesting backgrounds. Initially, we identified that in addition to former positions in the government in Romania, the individual was also formerly employed at a state-owned energy company. And this identified risk relating to political exposure and the potential for state involvement or influence in the project going forwards. And obviously, with political exposure, there are further kind of issues relating to an increase in bribery, potentially in kind of nepotism and using those political connections inappropriately. And this alone was ringing alarm bells for our client. But as we delved deeper and conducted some further searches, we also identified references to this individual being involved in an organized crime group, and that in the past he had actually passed secret information to these groups for them to exploit and gain from. This obviously was a massive red flag for our clients, and was a real key driver in how they kind of developed this relationship further and their additional steps. But in addition to finding this information about this individual, we also identified some general information that was very much of interest to them, relating to the rest of this project. If there was the option to remove this individual, this information put the rest of the project put some question marks around that. And part of that, we identified some issues relating to energy installations in Romania at the time, and a number of regulatory changes that had been made regarding green certificates, which essentially was holding up a huge number of installations in Romania at the time. Now, all of this information helped our clients to form a real kind of clear picture of what they were potentially getting themselves in for, but it allowed them to make a well-informed decision on how these risk elements kind of rank against their risk appetite, and it gave them time to put mitigating measures in place. So what should you do to make sure you're not taken advantage of, or worse, ultimately exposed to regulatory scrutiny or reputational damage? There's a few things that we can do here. Firstly, really to establish the market sentiment of a company's history and reputation, and see how well they're placed. You want to look at the background of the executive leadership and the board of directors, including some of their you look at their past behaviors, look at potential and possible conflicts of interest in some of their activities. As Amro mentioned, you want to look at their shareholder and ownership structure, which is extremely important to identify the UBO and understand their relationship with either conflicts of interest, with other sanctioned individuals or companies, or political exposure that they may be exposed to. If you're able to as well, you want to look at the existence of their compliance programs. If you're dealing with another party and you're able to ask them to provide evidence of that, it's a great question to ask. It gives you insight into how importantly they take corruption and compliance within their business. But obviously, the biggest red flag is if there's no compliance program in place, or they don't want to provide that to you. As Amro said, that really should be treated as a real kind of explicit red flag. You want to look at any open litigation or regulatory or compliance investigations that are ongoing at the moment, and what the impact of that could be on the reputation of their company, but also on your reputation, depending on what's out there. And then, like we said, look at those third-party risks. Consider the industry risks, the jurisdiction-specific risks, or any sanctions exposure that this company might have. Great, so moving on, Amro has also mentioned and highlighted some of those social and community issues, and I think this is something that we do definitely want to spend a little bit more time on. because it is very much the forefront of discussions at the moment, and we are looking to potentially kind of cover a bit more of this in much more depth in a future webinar. But it's worth mentioning, when dealing with an existing project or a joint venture partner, for example, it really is essential to understand the impact of that project and what that impact has been on the environment and those around it. And if you're implementing a project, you need to assess that impact. It's essential as part of those risk mitigation measures. Now, whether it's a solar farm that requires deforestation in order to accommodate it, or whether it's a wind farm that has an adverse effect on those living nearby, potentially due to a change in water courses or historic access to land that's being revoked, it's essential to understand the social and environmental impact. Again, to understand that risk and put measures in place to mitigate it and manage it. And establishing the impact of the local community, both during construction and any impact once that's built, is key, as well as understanding any labour issues during construction or maintenance of those assets, if you're working in certain jurisdictions where there is a potential for that to be a much bigger issue. So while we're talking about third parties, we can move on to how do we understand and mitigate that third party risk. And for those of you that are working kind of in the manufacturing element, and for those operators, third-party risk is a real key issue. And understanding the risk profiles of those third parties and particularly intermediaries will help to ensure that you focus on those third parties that pose the biggest risk to your business. Risk assessments and risk segmentation really should be used to allocate resources to ensure that those highest risk third parties, they don't have any, that you want to ensure they don't have a history of bribery or fraud or corruption, and that you fully understand and they fully understand how to conduct themselves on your behalf. And that really forms the backbone of the FCPA and UK Bribery Act. But this has really helped and proved to be effective in avoiding reputational issues down the line, based on the extensive work that we've done with our clients in the past. Questionnaires can be used very much to verify your initial assessment. So once you've looked through your third parties, looked through the data that you have and understood that, you can use questionnaires to verify that and ask those third parties to volunteer other information that's going to be of relevance. And you can use those questionnaires, as Amro said before, to test whether they're going to volunteer information to you, for them to kind of provide information about what they've done to change that behavior, or whether they're going to withhold that from you, and that also can form part of that decision-making process. But making those third parties, those intermediaries, aware of your policies and your expectations about how they should conduct business on your behalf really sets the scene for them. And requiring them to sign and accept these policies really provides you with that defense, like I mentioned, against some of those acts that are out there. Now, we produce and conduct a benchmarking report around anti-bribery and anti-corruption. There's one that's going to be coming out very, very shortly. But looking back on the data in 2020, we could see that just over half of the respondents reported that their programs were effective or highly effective, suggesting that there's much more that can still be done and improvements still to make around those ABC policies and programs. Now, moving on to due diligence, and adequate due diligence is a real key tool to ensure that those unscrupulous third parties and intermediaries are avoided and they're rooted out early on. So like we've mentioned before, ensuring that they're an established company capable of delivering what is promised, and ensuring that there are no historical concerns can really help your company to avoid unnecessary risks. Due diligence can also help to identify other issues of concern in the supply chain, such as forced labor. And one thing that really has come up recently, the US Solar Energy Industries Association has recently released a solar supply chain traceability protocol document, which can really help companies understand what they can do to root out unethical behavior in the supply chains. And I really encourage everyone to go and find that, to have a look through that, to familiarize yourself with that. There's some great insight in there that can be used within your programs. But lastly, just wanted to say not to forget to set renewal dates for reassessing those third parties. We know the risk levels change. We know that their activities will change. Things will come up. Events will come to the surface. And it's critical to, as part of your risk segmentation in your program, that you assign reassessment dates for those different categories of risk to ensure that those levels haven't changed, that you identify things in a timely manner. So lastly, before we finish, I just wanted to highlight one last key kind of risk area, which is cyber risk. Now, as many of you, I'm sure, will have seen, there's been a marked increase in the use of ransomware to extort large amounts of money from companies. Energy companies and utilities companies in particular are being targeted at the moment. They're seen as a real key rich vein for these hackers to be able to hack into these companies because of the reliance on these companies to provide services to consumers. So most of you will follow the developments with the Colonial Pipeline, which is a pipeline in the eastern seaboard of the US, which is supplying petrol particularly to the northeast corner of the US, and will likely have seen some of those scenes of panic buying that we have seen over the last the last week or so. And the CEO of the Colonial Pipeline operator, apparently they decided to pay the ransom. They paid around $4.4 million in order to restore their access to their systems and to alleviate the problem. But they believe the overall cost to be much higher to the business. And really, the parting message here is to ensure that cyber risk is also at the forefront of your risk assessment processes, and that's not overlooked. Full cyber audits are certainly needed in some situations, but there are other situations when discrete cyber assessments can really be used to give an indication of a company's overall cybersecurity practices, whether they've got obvious flaws in their external facing systems, or if servers are not patched correctly. These are the types of things that can be very easily assessed and easily seen. And these indicators are usually the openings that hackers need to get in and set up shop. Reviewing these risks up front and understanding where some of your third parties, if they have critical access to your systems, they have customer data, or they're a third party that you heavily rely upon, you're understanding the risks, the cyber risk that they present and their organization presents. It should really be at the forefront of what you're looking at the moment. And understanding these risks, helping them to then resolve them, really can prevent some major issues further down the line.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Really great insights from both you and Amro on both the financial as well as the compliance requirements. I think some of the key takeaways is to be proactive, of course, in your compliance program. As we all know on this webinar, compliance is a living, breathing document and necessitates 24/7 commitment by those in this space. And this industry is one that is going to, no question, mandate that. I think that as we look at this and the ability to be accountable, transparent, and implement a risk-based approach, it is going to take individuals, not only the compliance professionals and the operators in this space, but also at the board level commitment and dedication across the board to be able to ensure that effective compliance is put forward. AML is quickly and rapidly being put forward to ensure that KYC of any potential investors is flushing out everything from illicit bad actors to beneficial owners at the end of the day. I think that, my personal takeaway is that this industry is going to be one that is going to be scrutinized, but it is also going to be expected that those in this space self-police themselves. And I think that the document that you referenced, Tom, that the Solar Energy Industry Association recently put out is a definite read. We also have heard that the Solar Energy UK is looking to publish a parallel document regarding human rights expectations and other regulatory expectations within the industry. We're coming up on a quarter to the hour, and we know that the audience has questions. So what we'd like to do right now is turn it over to my colleague Mallory, who is going to pose to Tom and Amro any potential questions that may have been brought forward.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks so much for making time for this. Hope you can hear me okay. Just to reiterate, please feel free to submit questions at any time by typing your question under the questions tab on the control panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can, but we'll follow up individually with any questions if we don't have time to answer. Additionally, a replay of today's presentation along with our PowerPoint slides will be made available early next week. I do have some questions coming in. This might be a good one for Amro. What are the challenges around project financing or financing renewables?
Thank you very much. That's indeed a very good question. It's something that I'm very passionate about as an ex-banker as well, and with in line as well with my current job. So to answer this question, there are three different aspects to this question. The first one is lack of expertise, lack of local expertise. I'm talking about the Middle East here, for example. In the Middle East, it's quite difficult to find local banks who have a well-established infrastructure teams, finance teams who can support with the financing of renewable energy projects. The second one, when you manage to find an international bank who's interested, they're usually interested, one, in a larger deal, so they don't want to do any ticket less than $5–10 million. They only want to interested to do much bigger deals, and the due diligence is usually very significant and very enhanced. So going back to this presentation, it's very important and critical that as a company you only do business with the correct customers and the correct supply chain, because banks will be checking on that as well before financing anything for you. But the problem is the expectation between the banks, what the banks expect from you to finance a deal, and customer expectations are not in line. So you as a developer in the middle will struggle to get both to meet in halfway. So banks will have a lot of expectation from you that you would get from the customer under the lease or PPA, and the customer would not want, of course, for obvious reasons, would not want to give away all the things that the banks are asking for. And then the third issue we have is access to information. There's not a lot of information available for customers here. So, for example, some customers and some businesses would not want to share the financials with you. And of course, that would, unlike, for example, Europe, those are available in the company's house, for example, the UK. In the Middle East, it's quite difficult to find information. Those are the main three issues you have, but the answer to that is always good corporate governance practice. Good compliance would always help you to get project finance, successful project financing, and to be able to finance your project, because renewable is capital, is highly capital invested industry. So you need a lot of capital, and you can't sustain it without access to good and sustainable financing. So it's very important to make sure that you get the compliance piece right and to approach the right customers to be able to secure financing for the project. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was really a good answer. We have another one come in. What is the one piece of advice you would give to investors going into the renewable sector?
Yeah, I'll start on that, Mallory. I think it's knowing who you're doing business with, right? I think that that's the number one expectation that is put forward, no matter what industry that you're in, but specifically this one, especially with its evolution. I know Tom and Amro both have some thoughts on this, so I'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think definitely that's absolutely essential to understand who you're doing business with. And I think just to expand on that, I think the other element, from my perspective, in the operation of kind of putting together due diligence for clients around this is time. The more time you have, the more you can understand. The more you can understand, the more that you can kind of plan and mitigate for. So we do have clients that will come to us sometimes at the very, very last minute. They will have been working on something for a while, and then at the last minute they'll think, oh yeah, we need to do some due diligence, and they'll impose a timeline that means it's very limiting in terms of what can be done from a meaningful perspective. And I would say make sure that your compliance processes are integrated into your M&A processes, your investment processes, your third-party processes, so that you have adequate time to understand who you're doing business with properly, and you have time to put those measures in place. And really, the most successful projects that we've seen and the clients that we work with are the ones that are organized in their approach, and they've got time to tackle those risks that are identified along the way. Sometimes it can be a bit bumpy, and time gives you options. If you're trying to do everything at the last minute, those options become much more closed down. So that would be another piece of advice I certainly would kind of would pass to those investors that are thinking about coming into that renewable sector, particularly if it's something that you're not familiar with.
And before I turn it over to you, Amber, I think I'd like to just add to what you said, Tom, because it really came to light here, is as a control, use contracts to be able to hold your partners accountable, right? Put specific compliance language in those contracts that gets them to validate and verify themselves to you and give you comfort that they're going to do what your entity and your enterprise expects of them as part of your compliance program and your code of conduct. Have them adhering to your code of conduct is paramount in this space. Amro, please, I see you nodding there, so I'm sure you have a comment you'd like to add also.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you so much, Tom. In fact, I think Tom has very kindly covered it all. I could just stress on absolutely understanding your customers, understanding who you're dealing with, understand the intentions, understand the mandate very well. That would be absolutely the key to ensure that you're doing business with the right investors, you're doing business with the right customers. I don't have anything further to add. Tom, very kindly, and between Tom and John, you very kindly covered it all. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think we have one. So how common are the corruption risks between solar and wind energy?
Yeah, I can start that one off, Mallory. Thank you. So I'd say there are certainly some similarities there, but I think there are also some differences. And if we look at land, I think that's probably a pretty key difference. For wind, we have to consider onshore and offshore and the differences there. If we take the UK for example, the Crown, the Queen, she owns the land under the sea within a certain distance of the coast, where a lot of these offshore wind farms are being placed, and companies will need to negotiate with those entities. And you'd expect the corruption risk for this task to be pretty low, considering we're talking about the Queen and the Crown. But a lot of the time there are intermediaries that are being used to facilitate some of those discussions, and that again is where some of those bribery and corruption risks lie with intermediaries. They're a very, very high risk third party that are used across all sectors. I'd say for both solar and wind onshore projects, they both still have the need to acquire the appropriate licenses, and the land as well to place those assets on. So I think in that part there are similar risks there, and I think also again with the social and environmental risks, slightly different but both present. Wind farms, for example, are usually there is an additional kind of element of them being deemed a bit more unsightly and a bit more intrusive, and they may be more likely to attract kind of greater attention from local residents that kind of oppose them and parties that oppose them compared to solar. So I think there are some similarities, but there are some definite differences between those two different forms of renewable energy.
Great, thank you. I think as we only have about 4 more minutes, this might be the last question. And I think this could probably be open to a few of you. How can good governance aid in meeting compliance requirements?
I'll start the conversation here. I think good governance is the expectation. And good governance is something that we all strive to accomplish as per the ethics of our respective organizations. I firmly fall back on, ethics and the definition of ethics being what people do or enterprises do when no one's looking. And I think that that is all predicated on the policies, procedures, systems, and controls that you have in place, the commitment from the senior leadership of an organization, and how the business operates day to day. I think the two go hand in hand as it relates to achieving accountability and transparency. And if you have a good governance strategy and the appropriate compliance programs, should a challenge be brought forth by a regulator or a government entity, you have the opportunity to be able to show that regulator that your governance is at the expected level of effectiveness. And I think that as part of that, as Tom and Amro have both said, due diligence is a huge component of governance, and effective due diligence is something that Tom touched on that has to be accomplished on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and Amro, sorry, go on, please.
That's all right. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, John. Thanks, Tom. I was just going to add that this is a culture that it must be embedded. That every single member of staff must understand that they need to live and breathe this culture. Need to live and breathe the compliance and understand that every single person in the company, they have a role play to play, an important role to play in managing the risk and making sure that compliance are met.
Yeah, thanks, Amro. And I think just to close this point out, I think we talk about good governance and compliance, and sometimes it can be seen as something that should be done, but that you're preventing something from happening, you're preventing kind of prosecution, you're preventing the regulators coming and looking at you, and certainly while that is true, you're there to prevent these issues from happening. I think people and our clients that are successful in this space and come back to us time and time again, they use not only kind of the work that we do around due diligence to prevent further issues, but they also use it for intelligence. It's there to provide information that can be used as part of contract negotiations. If there is an issue there that is potentially affecting the reputation of the company you're dealing with, that may change things for you. If there's something that's open that you need to resolve beforehand, you can build that, you can mitigate that risk and build that into the contract to protect you as a company. And so there are a number of things that the due diligence can provide in terms of just making sure that you're not dealing with people you shouldn't. It can also provide insight that can be used as kind of leverage, can be beneficial to you as you structure your deals and provide more value to your company. So it should be seen as a value addition as well in that context.
And Tom, you brought up a really great point that I'd like to follow up on before we close. Know the regulatory obligations, not only in the jurisdiction that you operate in, but also in the jurisdictions that you seek to do business in, most importantly, and monitor those regulatory requirements because they're ever changing. As we saw today in brief 60 minutes, we spoke to some expectations that are out there. There's new ones that will probably be coming down the pike. So I think everyone has provided a great deal of insights. I want to personally, on behalf of our firm, Amro, thank you for your time and your efforts and your valuable insights and experiences in the industry. As always, it's a pleasure spending time with my colleague, Tom Hollowbone, even though we're separate and distinct across the pond. But look forward to catching up with each of you. And to our attendees, thank you for taking the time today. And hopefully you found the content impactful and interesting that was provided to you. Have a great rest of your days around the globe. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.